History of the United States, Chapter 3. Spanish Discoveries in America. It was reserved for the people of a sunnier clime than Iceland first to make known to the European nations the existence of a western continent. Spain was the happy country under whose patronage a new world was to be added to the old. But the man who was destined to make the revelation was not himself a Spaniard. He was to come from Italy, the land of valor and the home of greatness. Christopher Columbus was the name of that man whom after ages have rewarded with imperishable fame. The idea that the world is round was not original with Columbus. The English traveler Sir John Mandeville had declared in the first English book ever written, A.D. 1356, that the world is a sphere, that he himself, when traveling northward, had seen the polar star approach the zenith, and that on going southward, the Antarctic constellations had risen overhead, and that it was both possible and practicable for a man to sail around the world and return to the place of starting. But Columbus was the first practical believer in the theory of circumnavigation, and although he never sailed around the world himself, he demonstrated the possibility of doing so. The great mistake with Columbus was not concerning the figure of the earth, but in regard to its size. He believed the world to be no more than 10,000 or 12,000 miles in circumference. He therefore confidently expected that after sailing about 3,000 miles to the westward, he should arrive at the East Indies, and to do that was the one great purpose of his life. Christopher Columbus was born at Genoa, Italy, in A.D. 1435. He was carefully educated, and then devoted himself to the sea. His own inclination, as well as his early training, made him a sailor. For 20 years he traversed the parts of the Atlantic adjacent to Europe. He visited Iceland, then went to Portugal, and finally to Spain. For more than 10 years the poor enthusiast was a beggar, going from court to court explaining to dull monarchs the figure of the earth and the ease with which the rich islands of the East might be reached by sailing westward. He found one appreciative listener, the noble and sympathetic Isabella, Queen of Castile. Be it never forgotten that to the faith and insight and decision of a woman, the final success of Columbus must be attributed. On the morning of the 3rd day of August 1492, Columbus, with his 3 ships, left the harbor of Palos. After 71 days of sailing, in the early dawn of October 12th, Rodrigo Triana, a sailor on the Pinta, set up a shout of "Land!" A gun was fired as the signal. The ships lay to. There was music and jubilee. And just at sunrise, Columbus stepped ashore, set up the banner of Castile in the presence of the natives, and named the island San Salvador. During the 3 remaining months of this first voyage, the islands of Concepcion, Cuba, and Haiti were added to the list of discoveries, and on the Bay of Caracola, in the last named island, was erected a fort, the first structure built by the Europeans in the New World. In the early part of January 1493, Columbus sailed for Spain, where he arrived in March and was everywhere greeted with rejoicings and applause. In September of the following autumn, Columbus sailed on his second voyage, which resulted in the discovery of the Windward Group and the islands of Jamaica and Puerto Rico. It was at this time that the first colony was established in Haiti, and Columbus's brother appointed governor. After an absence of nearly 3 years, Columbus returned to Spain, but he now found himself the victim of bitter jealousies and suspicions. All the rest of his life was clouded with persecutions and misfortunes. In 1498, Columbus made a 3rd voyage, discovered the island of Trinidad and the mainland of South America, near the mouth of the Orinoco. Thence he sailed back to Haiti, where he found his colony disorganized, and here, while attempting to restore order, he was seized by an agent of the Spanish government, put in chains, and carried to Spain. After much disgraceful treatment, he was sent out on a 4th and last voyage, in search of the Indies. But besides making some explorations along the south side of the Gulf of Mexico, the expedition accomplished nothing, and Columbus returned once more to his ungrateful country. The good Isabella was dead, and the great discoverer, a friendless and despised old man, sank into the grave. Of all the wrongs done to the memory of Columbus, the greatest was that which robbed him of the name of the new continent. In the year 1499, Amerigo Vespucci, a Florentine navigator of no great celebrity, reached the eastern coast of South America. 2 years later, he made a second voyage, and then hastened home to give Europe the first published account of the Western world. In his narrative, all reference to Columbus was omitted, and thus through his own craft, assisted by the dullness of the times, the name of this Vespucci, rather than that of the true discoverer, was given to the New World. The discovery of America produced great excitement in Europe. In Spain, especially, there was a wonderful zeal and enthusiasm. Within 10 years after the death of Columbus, the principal islands of the West Indies were explored and colonized. In the year 1510, the Spaniards planted on the Isthmus of Darien the first continental colony. 3 years later, de Balboa, the governor of the colony, crossed the isthmus, and from an eminence looked down upon the Pacific. Not satisfied with merely seeing the great water, he waited in a short distance, and drawing his sword, took possession of the ocean in the name of the King of Spain. Meanwhile, Ponce de Leon, who had been a companion of Columbus, fitted out a private expedition of discovery and adventure. He had grown rich as governor of Puerto Rico, and had also grown old. But there was a fountain of perpetual youth somewhere in the Bahamas, so said a tradition in Spain, and in that fountain the old soldier would bathe and be young again. So in the year 1512 he set sail from Puerto Rico, and on Easter Sunday came in sight of an unknown shore. There were waving forests, green leaves, and birds of song, partly in honor of the day called in the ritual of the church Pascua Florida, and partly to describe the delightful landscape. He named the new shore Florida, the land of flowers. A landing was made a short distance north of where, a half-century later, St. Augustine was founded. The country was claimed for the King of Spain, and the search was continued for the Fountain of Youth. The romantic adventurer turned southward, explored the coast for many leagues, discovered the Tortugas, and then sailed back to Puerto Rico, no younger than when he had started. The King of Spain gave Ponce the governorship of his land of flowers and sent him thither to establish a colony. He did not, however, reach his province until the year 1521, and then the Indians were hostile. Scarcely had he landed when they fell upon him in battle. Many of the Spaniards were killed, and the rest had to fly to the ships for safety. Ponce de Leon himself was wounded with an arrow and carried back to Cuba to die. Recapitulation. Spain makes the New World known to Europe. Old ideas about the figure of Earth. Columbus. Sketch of his life. The favor of Isabella. Columbus departs on his first voyage. Discovers San Salvador, Cuba, and Haiti. Second voyage of Columbus. Third, he discovers South America. Fourth voyage. Columbus's misfortunes and death. Wrong done to his memory. Vespucci makes 2 voyages to South America. Excitement in Europe. A colony is planted on the isthmus. Balboa discovers the Pacific. Ponce de Leon makes explorations in Florida. Is killed by the Indians. Chapter 4. Spanish Discoveries in Americas. Continued. The year 1517 was marked by the discovery of the Yucatan by Fernandez de Cordova. While exploring the northern coast of this country, his company was attacked by the natives, and he himself mortally wounded. During the next year, the coast of Mexico was explored for a great distance by Grijalva, assisted by Cordova's pilot, and in the year 1519 Fernando Cortez landed with his fleet at Tabasco, and in 2 years conquered the Aztec Empire of Mexico. Among the daring enterprises which marked the beginning of the 16th century, that of Ferdinand Magellan is worthy of special mention. A Portuguese by birth, a navigator by profession, this bold man determined to discover the Southwest Passage to Asia. With this object in view, he appealed to the King of Portugal for ships and men. The monarch listened coldly and gave no encouragement. Incensed at this treatment, Magellan went to Spain and laid his plans before Charles V. The emperor seized the opportunity and ordered a fleet of 5 ships to be fitted out at the public expense and properly manned. The voyage was begun from Seville in August of 1519. Magellan soon reached the coast of South America and spent the autumn in explorations. Not at first successful in his efforts, he passed the winter on the coast of Brazil. Renewing his voyage southward, he came at last to the strait which still bears his name, and passing through found himself in the open and boundless ocean. The weather was beautiful, and the peaceful deep was called the Pacific. Magellan now held steadily on his course for nearly 4 months, suffering much from want of water and scarcity of provisions. In March of 1520, he came to the group of islands called the Ladrones. Sailing still westward, he reached the Philippine group, where he was killed in a battle with the natives. But the fleet was now near to China, and the rest of the route was easy. A new captain was chosen, and the voyage was continued to the Moluccas. Only a single ship was now deemed in a fit condition to venture on the homeward voyage, but in this vessel the crews embarked and, returning by way of the Cape of Good Hope, arrived in Spain in September 1522. The circumnavigation of the globe, long believed in as a possibility, had now been accomplished. The next important voyage to America was in the year 1520. De Leon, a judge in St. Domingo, conducted the expedition. He and 6 other wealthy men, eager to stock their plantations with slaves, determined to do so by kidnapping natives from the Bahamas. 2 vessels were fitted out for the purpose, and De Leon commanded in person. When the ships were nearing their destination, they encountered a storm which drove them northward and brought them to the coast of South Carolina. The name of Chicora was given to the country, and the river Cambahi was called the Jordan. The friendly natives made presents to the strangers and treated them with great cordiality. They flocked on board the ships, and when the decks were crowded, De Leon weighed anchor and sailed away. A few days afterward, a storm wrecked one of the ships, and most of the poor wretches who were huddled under the hatches of the other died. Returning to Spain, De Leon repeated the story of his exploit to Charles V, who gave him the governorship of Chicora. On reaching his province in 1525, he found the natives hostile. His best ship ran aground in the mouth of the Jordan, and the Indians fell upon him with fury, killing many of the crew. The rest were glad enough to get away with their lives. In 1526, Charles V appointed de Narvaez governor of Florida. The territory thus placed at his disposal extended from Cape Sable 3/5 of the way around the Gulf of Mexico. De Narvaez arrived at Tampa Bay in April of 1528. His force consisted of 260 soldiers and 40 horsemen. The natives treated them with suspicion, and holding up their gold trinkets pointed to the north. The hint was eagerly caught by the Spaniards, whose imaginations were fired with the sight of the precious metal. They struck boldly into the forests, expecting to find cities and empires, and found instead swamps and savages. Crossing the Withlacoochee and the Suwannee, they finally came to Appalachia, a squalid village of 40 cabins. This, then, was a mighty city to which their guides had directed them. Oppressed with fatigue and goaded by hunger, they plunged again into the woods and wandered on, until they reached the sea at the harbor of St. Mark's, where they expected to find their ships. But not a ship was there, or had been. With great labor they constructed some brigantines and put to sea in hope of reaching the Spanish settlements in Mexico. After shipwrecks and almost endless wanderings, only 4 miserable men of all the company, under the leadership of the heroic de Vaca, were rescued at the village of San Miguel on the Pacific coast and conducted to the city of Mexico. In the year 1537, a new expedition was planned which surpassed all the others in the brilliancy of its beginnings and the disasters of its end. Ferdinand de Soto was the leader. At his own request, he was appointed governor of Cuba and Florida, with the privilege of exploring and conquering the latter country. A great company of young Spaniards flocked to his standard. Of these, he elected 600 of the most gallant and daring. Great preparations were made for the conquest. Arms and stores were provided, shackles were wrought for the slaves, and tools for the forge and workshop were supplied. 12 priests were chosen to conduct religious ceremonies, and a herd of swine was driven on board to fatten on the maize and mast of the country. Leaving the harbor of San Lucar, the fleet touched at Havana, and the enthusiasm was kindled to a higher pitch than in Spain. De Soto left his wife to govern Cuba during his absence, and after a voyage of 2 weeks, the ships cast anchor in Tampa Bay. Some of the Cubans who had joined the expeditions were terrified at the prospect before them and sailed back to the security of home. But De Soto and his cavaliers despised such cowardice and began their march into the interior. In October of 1539, they arrived at the country of the Appalachians, on the left bank of the Flint River, where they spent the winter. For 4 months, they remained in this locality, sending out exploring parties in various directions. One of these companies reached the Gulf at Pensacola, and made arrangements that supplies should be sent out from Cuba to that place during the following summer. In the early spring, the Spaniards left their winter quarters and continued their march to the north and east. An Indian guide told them of a powerful and populous empire in that direction. A woman was empress, and the land was full of gold. A Spanish soldier who had been captive among the Indians denied the truth of the story, but De Soto and the freebooters pressed on through the swamps and woods. In April 1540, they came upon the Ogeechee River. Here they were delayed. The Indian guide went mad and lost the whole company in the forest. By the 1st of May, they had reached South Carolina and were within a 2 days' march of where d'Aulon had lost his ships. From this place, the wanderers turned westward and passed across northern Georgia, from the Chattahoochee to the upper tributaries of the Coosa, thence down that river to lower Alabama. Here, just above the confluence of the Alabama and the Tombeckbee, they came upon the Indian town of Mobile, where a battle was fought with the natives. The town was set on fire, and 2,500 of the Indians were killed or burned to death. 18 of De Soto's men were killed and 150 wounded. The Spaniards also lost most of their horses and baggage. The ships of supply had meanwhile arrived at Pensacola, but De Soto and his men were too proud to avail themselves of help. Turning to the north by the middle of December, they reached the country of the Chickasaws. They crossed the Yazoo, snow fell, and the Spaniards were on the point of starvation. They succeeded, however, in finding some fields of maize and an Indian village which promised them shelter for the winter. Here in February 1541, they were attacked in the night by the Indians, who set the town on fire, determining to make an end of the foreigners. But Spanish weapons and discipline again saved De Soto and his men. The Spaniards next set out to journey farther westward, and the guides brought them to the Mississippi. The point where the Father of Waters was first seen by white men was a little north of the 34th parallel of latitude. The day of the discovery cannot certainly be known. The Indians came down the river in a fleet of canoes and offered to carry the Spaniards over, but a crossing was not effected until the latter part of May. De Soto's men now found themselves in the land of the Dakotas. The natives were inoffensive and superstitious. At one place, they were going to worship the Spaniards, but De Soto would not permit such idolatry. They continued their march to the St. Francis River, which they crossed, and reached the site of New Madrid. Thence westward, the march was renewed for about 200 miles. Thence southward to the tributaries of the Wichita River. On the banks of this stream, they passed the winter of 1541 to 1542. Here the Spaniards treated the natives with savage cruelty. De Soto's men now turned toward the sea, and came upon the Mississippi in the neighborhood of the Natchez. The spirit of the leader was completely broken. A malignant fever seized upon his emaciated frame, and then death. The priest chanted a requiem, and in the middle of the night his companions put his body into a rustic coffin and sunk it into the Mississippi. Before his death, De Soto had named Moscoso as his successor. Under his leadership, the half-starved adventurers turned once more to the west. They crossed the country to the upper waters of the Red River, and then ranged the hunting grounds of the Pawnees and the Comanches. In December of 1542, they came again to the Mississippi, a short distance above the mouth of the Red River. Here they built 7 boats, and on the 2nd day of July, 1543, set sail for the sea. The distance was almost 500 miles, and 17 days were required to make the descent. On reaching the Gulf of Mexico, they steered to the southwest, and finally reached the settlement at the mouth of the River of Palms. The next attempt by the Spaniards to colonize Florida was in the year 1565. The enterprise was entrusted to Pedro Melendez, a Spanish soldier of ferocious disposition. He was under sentence to pay a heavy fine at the time when he received his commission from Philip II. Melendez was to plant in some favorable district of Florida a colony of not less than 500 persons, and was to receive 225 square miles of land adjacent to the settlement and a large salary. 2,500 persons joined the expedition. The real object had in view by Melendez was to destroy a colony of French Protestants called the Huguenots, who had made a settlement near the mouth of the St. Johns River. This was within the limits of the territory claimed by Spain, and the Melendez thought that to kill French heretics in the name of patriotism and religion was the way in which to restore his character and bring him into favor again. His former crimes were to be washed out in the blood of innocent men. The Catholic party at the French court had communicated with the Spanish court as to whereabouts and intentions of the Huguenots, so that Melendez knew where to find and how to destroy them. It was St. Augustine's Day when the Spaniards came in sight of the shore, but the landing was not effected until the 2nd day of September. The harbor and the river which enters it from the south were named in honor of the saint. On the 8th day of the same month, Philip II was proclaimed monarch of North America. A solemn mass was said by the priests, and the foundation stones of the oldest town in the United States were put into their place. This was 17 years before the founding of Santa Fe, and 42 years before the settlement of Jamestown. Melendez soon turned his attention to the Huguenots. The latter were expecting to be attacked, and all their vessels except 2 sailed out of the river and put to sea, intending to anticipate the movements of the Spaniards. But a furious storm arose and dashed to pieces every ship in the fleet. Most of the crews, however, reached the shore at the mouth of the river. Melendez collected his forces at St. Augustine, stole through the woods, and falling on the defenseless colony, utterly destroyed it. Men, women, and children were alike given up to butchery. 200 were massacred. A few escaped into the forest. Laudonnière, the Huguenot leader among the number, and were picked up by the 2 French ships which had been saved from the shore. The crews of the wrecked vessels were the next object of vengeance. Melendez discovered them, and deceiving them with the treacherous promises, he induced them to surrender. They were ferried across the river and driven off, tied 2 and 2 toward St. Augustine. As they approached the Spanish fort, a signal was given and the work of slaughter began anew. 700 defenseless victims were slain. Only a few mechanics and Catholic servants were left alive. With this bloody work, the first permanent European colony was planted in our country. The Spaniards had now explored the coast from the Isthmus of Darien to Port Royal in South Carolina. They were acquainted with the country west of the Mississippi, as far north as New Mexico and Missouri. And east of that river, they had traversed the Gulf states as far as the mountain ranges of Tennessee and North Carolina. With the establishment of their first permanent colony on the coast of Florida, the period of Spanish voyage and discovery may be said to end. A brief account of the only important voyages of the Portuguese to America will here be given. At the time of the discovery by Columbus, John II was king of Portugal, but he paid little attention to the New World. In 1495, he was succeeded by his cousin Manuel, a man of different character. This monarch, in order to secure some of the benefits which yet remained to discoverers, fitted out 2 vessels, and in the summer of 1501 sent Gaspar Porto Real to make a voyage to America. The Portuguese ships reached Maine in July and explored the coast for nearly 700 miles. Little attention was paid by Corte-Real to the great forests of pine which stood along the shore, promising shipyards and cities. He satisfied his rapacity by kidnapping 50 Indians, whom, on his return to Portugal, he sold as slaves. A new voyage was then undertaken, with the purpose of capturing another cargo of natives. But a year went by and no tidings arrived from the fleet. The brother of the Portuguese captain then sailed in hope of finding the missing vessels. He also was lost, but in what manner is not known. The fate of the Corte-Reals and their slave ships has remained a mystery of the sea. Recapitulation. Cordova discovers Yucatan. Grijalva explores Mexico. Cortez invades and conquers the country. Magellan sails around South America. His crews reach the East Indies. Return to Europe. Narvaez is appointed governor of Florida. Explores the country. The company is shipwrecked. 4 men reach San Miguel. De Soto sets out on an expedition, arrives at Tampa Bay, spends the winter on Flint River. The company march into South Carolina, cross into Georgia, capture Mauville, spend a winter on the Yazoo, discover the Mississippi, explore Arkansas and return. De Soto dies. His men again march westward, return to Red River, descend the Mississippi, reach the Spanish settlements. Melendez comes to Florida and founds St. Augustine, murders the Huguenots, massacres the shipwrecked crews. Extent of the Spanish explorations. The Portuguese voyage of Gaspar Corte-Real. He sells a cargo of Indian slaves. The Corte-Reals are lost at sea.